Emily Carter arrived in Red Valley with a suitcase full of work clothes and a head full of ordinary dreams. She and her husband had come west for the same reason thousands of others did, to build something that belonged to them: a small herd of cattle, a weathered wooden barn, and a patch of land pressed up against the foothills of the mountains. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The first winter took her husband. Pneumonia came fast, the way cold sometimes does in the high country. Quiet at first, then merciless. By spring, Emily stood alone beside a half-empty barn and a house that felt too large for one heartbeat. She was 29, widowed before she had learned how to stop leaning on someone else. The neighbors were kind in the way people are when they don't know what else to be. They brought casseroles, chopped firewood, and spoke gently about options. Some suggested she sell the land and move closer to town. Others hinted she might remarry quickly. A woman alone with livestock was a risky story out here. Emily nodded and thanked them. Then she went back to work. By late fall, the signs were already bad. The barn boards warped from summer heat and left thin gaps where wind whispered through. The cattle grew restless at night, shifting and stamping as if they could feel winter rehearsing in the mountains. Every morning, Emily broke ice in the water trough with a hammer and wondered how long the animals could keep burning their own strength just to stay warm. At night, she sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, counting feed and counting days. The numbers didn't lie. If winter hit hard, she would lose animals. If she lost animals, she would lose the farm. It wasn't pride keeping her there. It was survival. One afternoon, while hauling hay from the back field, she noticed something she had passed 100 times without seeing. A shallow cave cut into the limestone ridge behind her pasture. It wasn't deep, just a dark mouth in pale rock, shaped by rain and time. Hunters sometimes sheltered there. Kids from town dared each other to step inside. Emily stood in front of it longer than she meant to. Cold winds slid across the valley, but inside the cave, the air felt different. Still, quiet. Not warm exactly, but steady. No sharp bite, no rushing gusts, just calm. She stepped inside, boots crunching over gravel. The rock walls were dry. The floor sloped slightly inward. Water trickled out instead of pooling in. She pressed her palm to the stone and felt something unexpected. Not cold like winter would, not warm like a stove, just neutral. That night, she couldn't sleep. The barn groaned as wind pushed against it, and somewhere outside, a cow bawled in protest. Emily lay staring at the ceiling, the cave in her mind like a picture she couldn't shake. Wood cracked. Stone endured. Wood leaked heat. Earth kept it. By morning, she had made a decision that scared her more than the cold ever had. If she was going to survive another winter in Red Valley, she couldn't do it the way everyone else did. She would have to try something no one believed in yet, and she would have to do it alone. Emily didn't announce her plan. In Red Valley, bold ideas traveled faster than winter storms, and she wasn't ready for either. She started with small things, dragging tools up the slope behind her pasture, clearing brush from the cave entrance, testing the ground with a shovel. The work felt strange at first, like she was trespassing on something older than fences and deeds. By the second week, people noticed. Tom Whitman rode past one afternoon and slowed his horse. He was built like the land itself, broad, weathered, confident in ways only long habit can make a man. He tipped his hat and watched Emily chip away at the stone. "What are you building back there?" he asked. "A shelter," she said, "for the cattle." Tom squinted toward the cave. "That's not a shelter. That's a hole in the mountain." Emily wiped sweat from her forehead. "It's steady inside, no wind, no ice." Tom laughed once, sharp and surprised. "Livestock don't belong underground. You'll suffocate them or rot your feed. Wood breathes, stone sweats." He rode on before she could answer. A few days later, Jacob Reed stopped by. He was the town carpenter, a man who trusted lumber the way preachers trust scripture. He stepped inside the cave and frowned at the walls. "This will trap moisture," he said. "You'll get mold, illness. You can't fix stone if it goes bad." "I'm cutting vents," Emily replied, "up high. Warm air goes out. Cold air stays low." Jacob shook his head. "You can't outsmart winter with a shovel." By the end of October, the rumors were louder than her hammer. At the general store, people whispered that grief had finally reached her mind. At church, women spoke softly about that poor girl and what loneliness can do. Some offered help with her barn, as if pretending the cave didn't exist would make it disappear. Emily kept working. She widened the entrance just enough to bring animals through without scraping their sides. She dug a shallow trench along the back wall so water would drain outward instead of pooling. She stacked hay in the deepest section where the ceiling dipped low, leaving the wider middle space for the cattle. She hung a thermometer from a nail driven into the rock and checked it morning and night. The numbers stayed calm: 46, 48, 45. Outside, frost painted the grass white before dawn. One evening, as she hauled boards to frame a double door, Tom Whitman returned with two other ranchers. They dismounted like men arriving for an intervention. "You're making a mistake," Tom said, standing in the cave entrance. "Animals need daylight, movement, air." "They have air," Emily said. "Slow air, not wind." "What happens when snow seals this up?" one man asked. "I'll keep the entrance clear." "What happens when spring floods it?" "The trench runs downhill." Tom's voice hardened. "You lose those cattle, you lose everything. You could sell now and start over." Emily stood with her hands on her hips, dirt on her sleeves, stone dust in her hair. "If I do what everyone else does, I'll lose them anyway." Silence followed her words. Not agreement, just the uncomfortable space after truth. "You think you know better than the rest of us?" Jacob asked. "No," she said. "I think the mountain does." They left without shaking her hand. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing for good. The barn groaned as boards contracted. The cave held its quiet. Emily sat on an overturned bucket inside it, listening to the sound of nothing happening. No wind howling, no ice cracking, just the slow breath of stone. She wasn't certain she was right. Certainty was for people with backup plans. All she had was a theory and a winter coming down the valley like a verdict. But as she closed the inner door and stepped back into the cold, she felt something she hadn't felt since her husband died. Not hope exactly, resolve. The first real snow came in early December, soft at first, then heavy enough to bend the fence rails. Emily moved the cattle into the cave before dawn, leading them one by one through the widened mouth of stone. They hesitated at the threshold, hooves clacking on rock, breath steaming in the cold air. Inside, the space smelled of hay and limestone. The walls held the quiet like a secret. She closed the outer door and tied back the canvas inner flap. The thermometer hung from its nail, steady as a judge. 47 degrees. Outside, Red Valley turned white. In town, winter began its usual work. Water troughs froze overnight. Barn boards shrank and split. Tom Whitman started burning extra hay just to keep his herd from shivering themselves thin. Jacob Reed spent long hours patching cracks, with frozen hands and stubborn faith in wood. Emily's routine was different. She hauled water once a day and watched it stay liquid. She forked hay from the back of the cave where it stayed dry. The cattle shifted less, slept more. Their breath barely fogged the air. At night, when winds screamed down the valley, the cave answered with nothing at all. By mid-December, people started paying attention. Not because they believed in her, but because winter was winning everywhere else. Then January arrived and dropped the mask. A storm rolled down from the north with a sky the color of iron. Snow buried the road. Wind slammed into barns like a fist. The temperature fell through zero and kept going, as if numbers were only suggestions. Emily stayed inside the cave longer than usual, lantern light flickering against stone. She brushed frost from the door frame and checked the vents with a stick to keep them open. The thermometer read 44. Her hands shook as she wrote it down. That night, the cold reached a depth the valley hadn't felt in years. In town, men broke ice with axes. Cows crowded into corners, ribs showing through winter coats. Tom Whitman lost 2 calves before dawn. Jacob Reed tore apart part of his own fence to feed the stove near his barn. At Emily's place, the cave did what stone had done for centuries. It did not hurry, it did not react. It held. She slept on a cot near the entrance, listening for sounds that meant trouble. Hooves slipping, animals crying, water dripping where it shouldn't. What she heard instead was chewing, slow and steady. By the third day, the storm tightened its grip. Drifts climbed the door. Emily shoveled a path with arms that burned and lungs that stung. When she stepped back inside, warmth, real warmth, met her face. Not fire heat, living heat. She pressed her palm to the wall again. The stone felt the same as it always had, 43 degrees. When the wind finally loosened its hold, the valley looked bruised. Fences leaned. Smoke rose thin and desperate from chimneys. Emily walked out into a world that felt smaller, quieter, as if something had been taken from it. She opened the cave doors and let light spill across the animals. They blinked and shifted, alive in a way that felt almost defiant. No frozen water, no stiff legs, no bodies to drag outside. That afternoon, Tom Whitman rode up without speaking. He dismounted and stood in the doorway, hat in hand. Inside, the cattle chewed and watched him with calm eyes. "How warm?" he asked. Emily pointed to the thermometer. 45. He stared at it, then at the walls, then back at her. Outside, the air still bit like a blade. Jacob Reed arrived next. He stepped inside and touched the stone as if expecting it to sweat or crumble. It did neither. Emily brought out her notebook. Feed counts, water logs, temperatures written in steady ink. No losses. The men said little. There was nothing left to argue with. The winter that was supposed to bury her had chosen another story. And Red Valley, for the first time, began to wonder if Stone knew something Wood never had. Word traveled fast after the storm broke. Not as gossip this time, but as numbers. How many animals lost? How much hay burned? How many nights spent awake listening for death in the dark? By the end of January, Emily's cave was no longer a joke. It was a question. Tom Whitman came back 2 days later, this time with a notebook of his own. He stood inside the cave longer than before, watching the cattle breathe, counting how often they shifted their weight. He touched the stone walls again, slower now, as if trying to feel the idea instead of fight it. "How much hay since December?" he asked. Emily opened her ledger. "About 12 pounds per head, per day." Tom did the math in his head. His jaw tightened. "I'm feeding close to 20. And still losing weight," she said gently. Jacob Reed arrived with tools instead of warnings. He brought a small level and a strip of cloth to test for dampness. He pressed it to the wall, then held it up to the lantern light. "Dry," he muttered. They moved through the cave together, checking the trench, the vents, the stacked hay. Everything was plain, nothing fancy, just choices that added up. The valley began sending visitors. One rancher after another rode up the slope behind Emily's pasture, each with the same look. Cautious hope mixed with pride they didn't want to lose. They asked the same questions. "Doesn't it smell?" "No." "Doesn't it get dark?" "Yes, but calm." "Don't they panic?" "Not when they're warm." Some stayed only a minute. Others stayed long enough to forget the cold outside. By mid-February, the change was visible beyond Emily's land. Down the road, a man named Clark Evans began carving into the sandstone ridge behind his barn. Two brothers from the south end of the valley stacked their timber structure against a rock wall and dug halfway into the hill. They didn't call it copying. They called it trying something smarter. Tom Whitman stood up at the feed store one morning and cleared his throat in front of men who had known him all his life. "I was wrong," he said. "Stone holds heat better than boards. I saw it myself." The room went quiet. Men didn't admit things like that unless winter had forced them to. Emily didn't celebrate. She kept her routine. Morning water, evening feed, notebook open on the shelf carved into rock. She added small improvements, a thicker inner door, a raised rack for hay so air could pass beneath it. The cave wasn't a miracle. It was a system. When spring finally loosened winter's grip, the cattle walked out stronger than they had gone in. Their coats were thick. Their steps were sure. Across the valley, ranchers dragged frozen losses from barns that had looked solid in October. One afternoon, Jacob Reed stayed behind after the others left. "You didn't beat winter," he said. "You went around it." Emily leaned against the cave wall. "I just stopped trying to scare it away." That was the part no one had taught her. Not to fight the cold, not to outbuild it, but to step into something older than storms and let it do the work. By April, the hills were muddy and the creek ran loud again. The cave looked the same as it always had, quiet, patient, unimpressed by what it had changed. Emily stood at the entrance and watched Clark Evans haul stone up his slope. She watched Tom sketch door frames in the dirt with a stick. She watched a valley that had lost too much begin to learn something new. The mountain had kept its secret for centuries. Now it was teaching the people who finally listened. By the next winter, Red Valley no longer looked the same. Along the hillsides, dark doorways appeared where there had once been only rock. Some were full caves like Emily's. Others were half-buried barns pressed into the earth, their backs braced against stone. Wood still mattered, but now it worked with the mountain instead of fighting it. Emily never called what she built an invention. To her, it was simply a choice. One made out of fear, patience, and a refusal to quit. But to the valley, it became something else. A second chance. Tom Whitman lost fewer animals that winter. So did Clark Evans. So did the brothers at the south end of the road. Feed lasted longer. Water froze less often. Nights were quieter. Men who used to spend hours breaking ice now spent them sleeping. One evening, Tom stopped by Emily's place as the sun slid behind the ridge. He stood beside her at the cave entrance, hands in his pockets. "You know what's strange," Emily said. "We thought strength meant building bigger barns. Turns out it meant knowing when not to." Emily smiled faintly. The mountain was here first. She kept her routine. She kept her notebook. She kept the cave simple. People came for advice, and she gave it without pride. Not because she wanted credit, but because she remembered what it felt like to be alone with winter on the way. The cave never became famous. There were no signs, no headlines. But in Red Valley, it became something more useful than a legend. It became normal. And that was the real change. Years later, children would grow up thinking livestock always stayed warm that way. They wouldn't remember the winters when animals froze in wooden barns, or the season when a young widow was laughed at for trusting stone more than tradition. But Emily remembered. She remembered standing in the cave with frost in her hair, listening to animals breathe while the wind tried to tear the valley apart. She remembered being told she was wrong. She remembered being right. Not because she was smarter, because she was willing to ask a dangerous question. What if the way we've always done it isn't the best way? So now let me ask you something. If you were standing in Red Valley that winter, what would you have chosen? Would you have stayed with the wooden barn because it looked familiar? Or would you have trusted the mountain, something older, quieter, and harder to argue with? What's the cave in your own life? The idea that feels strange, the path no one else is walking yet, the solution hiding in plain sight because it doesn't look like progress? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and what the hardest winter or challenge you've ever faced taught you about survival. And if this story made you see primitive and smart in a new way, don't forget to like and subscribe. Every week we share stories about people who didn't win by being louder. They won by listening to the land, to the numbers, and to themselves. Sometimes the strongest shelter isn't what you build on top of the earth. It's what you build with it.